I'm Zoe Daniel. I'm the independent federal member for Goldstein. So I was elected at the 2022 federal election and I represent this seat in the federal parliament in Canberra.
What's your favourite movie?
Love Actually. Christmas movies. It's a nice time of year.
And who's your favourite musician or artist or band or something along those lines?
Look, I have a pretty wide taste in music. I do like Taylor Swift. I'm a bit of a Swiftie. Love Paul Kelly from an Australian music perspective, and probably a bit of Aussie rock from when I was growing up, so Hunters and Collectors.
Cost of living this time of year, not just this time of year, but in this electoral term, has been a very divisive issue. Some people saying it's this person's fault, that person's fault. Where do you stand on cost of living, and how are you helping people fight cost of living?
Cost of living is definitely a really prominent issue, and it's quite a different political environment than it was before the last federal election because of inflation. Obviously, there are both local and international factors. So a part of the cost of living pressure has come from international gas prices, and that was in part driven by the conflict in Ukraine. But there have been local factors as well, including spending on government infrastructure, especially state government infrastructure. And obviously there are some pretty blunt instruments in Australia to deal with that, and one of them, the main one, is interest rates. So in this electorate where the cost of real estate is really high, no matter whether you're buying and have a mortgage or whether you're renting, your costs on that side are really high, and people absolutely are feeling the pinch. I think too, though, there's some economic anxiety associated with that. So even people, perhaps older people who've got their house paid off, who are self-funded retirees who might not be feeling that direct cost of living pressure so much, are still feeling concerned about the economic environment. So that's definitely a big issue for most people. As far as things that I can do, one thing was to support the broadening of the stage 3 tax cuts, and that's something that I lobbied the government heavily on so that that was fairer. Capping gas prices was something that I've voted in favour of, but I've also worked really hard on changing the way that HECS debt's calculated. So student debt's been wiped by $3 billion, and that's benefited more than 20,000 people in Goldstein who have HECS debt. There's still more work to do on that front. And one of my big policy pushes is universal childcare, or early childhood education and care, because for many families in this electorate, the cost of childcare is the second highest cost after the mortgage. And for many working mothers, it's too expensive to work because of the cost of care if you have more than one child. So that's a work in progress. So there's a whole lot of things in play in regard to cost of living, but definitely a very prominent issue.
To slightly go in a different direction, still relating to the economy though, how are you exactly helping get the economy under control?
Well, there are some challenges in the economy at the moment, but we have seen inflation coming down, which is good, and we've seen the first interest rate cut in several years, which certainly I know people in the electorate really appreciate. There are, several other things like the ones that I've described that take a bit more time to flow through into the economy. People have received, for example, some cost of living relief from the government in regard to energy bills. One of my roles as a member of the crossbench is to try to explain to the government what's happening in our community and to communicate that really clearly, so to send that information up and then to pressure the government to act on that. One of the big policy pieces that I've been prosecuting since before the 2022 election as well is everything on the table tax reform, because high income taxes are a real struggle, particularly for young people who are trying to buy into the housing market, who are really hamstrung by the amount of tax that they pay on income. So again, that's a work in progress. Unfortunately, economic reform and these big structural changes can't happen overnight, and they don't happen on 3 yearly electoral cycles either, which means that the two major parties are unwilling to actually execute them because their biggest concern is getting re-elected. So they find it difficult to grapple with really long-term policy thinking, and that's part of the reason that I'm there, is to try to force them to actually tackle those things, but also to bring these conversations around things like tax reform into the public arena to enable a public conversation about those things so that we start getting some of the big structural changes that we need.
You spoke a moment there about the crossbench being very important. What are your thoughts on the crossbench in general? Like, do you think, of course I'm assuming you assume it's a very important thing, but do you think it's overly relied on, or what are your thoughts on it?
Well, I think that what we've seen in Australian politics, particularly over the last, say, 10 to 20 years, is a lot of stalled policy making. So I think it's pretty rich of the major parties to purport to be the ones that can make good policy when they haven't made good policy on things like climate, they haven't made good policy on things like housing, they haven't tackled tax reform, which is something that we really need for intergenerational equity. And that's why now more than 30% of the population, so more than a third of people, are voting not for the major parties, but for people who are on the crossbench who they think can create that kind of accountability. I take that job really seriously. That's why I'm there. And certainly from my point of view, I'm not a blocker. I actually collaborate. So I think my job is to work with the government of the day, whoever that might be, to point out the gaps in their policy, to build a case for fixing those issues so that we make better policy, so that we enact better legislation, and so that flows through to benefit most people. So the job is actually a job of collaboration. What we've seen in Australian politics and indeed politics across the world is a really combative partisan style of politics, where one major party says I want to do something, the other major party says no, and they basically can't have a conversation about how to move anything forward. So what the crossbench does is actually have that conversation and say, okay, you're the government, you want to do this, these are the problems with what you want to do, this is what the evidence says around how we can fix it, and this is how we can move it forward. Or sometimes if it's just bad policy, well, no, that's not going to pass because it doesn't stack up for the population. But that feedback comes from expert analysis and really rigorously thinking about those things, and also deep feedback and engagement with community, because those of us who are community independents were put here by people who want politics done differently, and that's what we do.
To speak more on the voting thing, we've been getting a lot of those flyers in the area saying like, oh, the Teals vote with this group or they vote with that group, and I'm sure you agree with that. It feels a bit disingenuous to just say, oh, they vote with this group, therefore bad. When we spoke to Tim Wilson in our interview, we got a chance to ask him about independents, and obviously he wasn't very much of a fan of them. He was saying a lot of criticisms towards you, so I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions regarding that. First off was, he said you campaigned on fighting climate change and bringing down taxes and that sort of stuff, but he's saying you haven't been able to do that and deliver that as an independent. What is your response to those remarks?
Well, there's several things in that question. The first thing that I'll speak to is the flyers that were delivered into letterboxes, and I would encourage people to be really careful about believing the misinformation and disinformation that is deliberately propagated during elections. People need to understand that we don't have truth in political advertising laws in Australia, so it's legal to lie in political advertising, so just be aware of that with things that you read. The way that the Liberal Party has endeavoured to manipulate information around the crossbench voting record is one example of that. For example, over the term, the Greens have put forward 40 motions. I voted yes to 22 of them and no to 18 of them, so roughly half the time I voted with them, half the time against them. And the things I voted for were largely climate and energy related pieces of legislation where, as you would expect, given that I campaigned on that, we're relatively aligned. So manipulation of voting records is something that the major parties tend to do, and I wouldn't take too much notice of it if I was a voter. In terms of being able to achieve things, well, the Climate Change Act, which was enacted during this term of Parliament, has a clause in it which says that 43% carbon emission reduction by 2030 is a floor, not a ceiling. Therefore, we need to at least reach that point. I put that into the legislation. That was an amendment that I was able to negotiate with the government because I was concerned that a future government, for example, a coalition government, which has no climate policy currently, might backslide on. So that is a very good example of an achievement on climate. Tax reform, work in progress, should happen and will definitely be something to push after the next election. But in the meantime, $3 billion HECS debt relief benefiting 21,000 former students and students in Goldstein is a good example of the crossbench being able to achieve things. There's also several pieces of legislation where I have, in line with my policy on women's economic empowerment, enabled legislation through amendments that I have drafted and negotiated with the government that women are considered in things like the National Reconstruction Fund and the way contracts are drawn up, in Jobs and Skills Australia and the way skills development is done, and in the Fair Work Act in the way that industrial relations is executed. They're amendments written by me that were negotiated with the government and are now in law. So just a few examples of things that I've been able to achieve from the crossbench.
That seems like a lot of very important things that you are doing in this electoral term. With the election coming up, I don't think they've decided on a date yet as of recording this, but with the election coming up, what do you think are the most important issues that the people of Goldstein should be focusing on this election?
So what I'll tell you is what the feedback is to me from people in the electorate. And because my approach to politics is actually to listen to people and to try to take on board their concerns rather than telling them what they should think. The umbrella issue for a lot of people remains integrity, trust and accountability and transparency in government. Trust is at a really low ebb across the world in leadership currently, in the corporate sector and also in the political sphere. People want more transparency, more accountability and more rigour in the way that taxpayer money is spent, in the way decisions are made, in the way that appointments to government departments are made and a whole range of things. So that sits as an umbrella over all policy. The second, I think, really big piece, and it goes to everything from cost of living and across everything that I've talked about, is intergenerational equity and the future of our young people, of which you are one. So everything from tax reform and the taxes you'll be paying into the future on your income if we don't fix the system, to good climate policy and a cohesive, considered rollout of renewable energy in the energy transition, to empowering women into the workforce to enable that half of the population to work to the extent that they want to student debt, to all of the things I've talked about, really go, and housing as well, which is critically important, really go to creating a better future for our children and not leaving our children with a worse standard of living to the one that we have. And that's something that I take really seriously. I could have said no when I was asked to run as an independent Member of Parliament. And having been a foreign correspondent for 15 years and spent a lot of time away from my family, it was not necessarily something that I expected myself to do at that time, to take on that kind of job. But in the end, it was my kids who said, "Mum, someone's got to get in the room and speak up for us." It can be difficult, especially against the might of two major parties who've been there for decades, for more than 100 years in that position of power.
120 years or something.
Yeah, to get in there and speak up differently, but I think it's really important and it's effective.
Well, those seem like a lot of important issues, and I feel like this conversation that we've been able to have is very important and very eye-opening to probably many of the people that are going to be watching this. A lot of them who I'm trying to target with this sort of stuff is younger people, because there's a lot of apathy towards politics for people our ages. Thank you so much for letting us have this conversation with you.
No, absolutely no worries. And look, I do think just on the the interest of young people in politics that I really appreciate the opportunity, and I spend a lot of time going to schools to talk to students, because I think that no matter which way you decide to vote, whether you vote Liberal, whether you vote Labor, whether you vote Green, whether you vote Independent, it is important to engage with the system, because it's your future. And I must say that I do find that young people engage with me and the work that I'm doing, and I think that it's fantastic that they do. And my advice to any young person watching this is take your power. You know, your vote is your power. Your ability to engage with your MP is your power, and tell your MP what you want. You can't expect them to know if you don't actually have the conversation, and it really does make a difference when you take the time, and it helps me, and I'm sure it helps every member of Parliament to have those conversations with young people in communities.